So welcome everybody to this Zoom webinar where we are going to discuss concepts for climate justice. How can we empower the most vulnerable? I am Andreas Kraemer, founder and former director of Ecologic Institute, and I will be your moderator today. Now we have an interesting program, but before we go into that, I hand over to Mrs. Odila Triebel from IFA for a further introduction, explanation of what this series of events is about.
So thank you very much, Andreas Kraemer. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to our web talk series, Totally Glocally, Europe from the Outside, with this year's focus in a series of 3 with a talk on how we are dealing with the climate crisis. In an increasingly condensed and rapidly changing world, the question of how Europe should engage with the world and how we can integrate broader perspectives, non-Western epistemologies, and thereby foster the solidarities around the globe is one of our main concerns. With María, Fernanda, Espinosa, currently Richard Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy, Ecuadorian politician and former president of the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly, we are very proud to welcome an extraordinary distinguished speaker today. Moreover, we are delighted to also welcome 2 outstanding practitioners from the field of art and youth education as respondents with us. Marcel, who is an artist and filmmaker from Brazil and shows her current work in the exhibition Umbrales at IFA Gallery Stuttgart, and Sushmina Baidya, fellow at IFA's CrossCulture program. The economies and populations that are the main contributors to the climate crisis are so far least affected by the consequences. And other countries that are undergoing economic development at a later stage are demanding to use resources in a similar way to those that completed industrialization earlier. We are keen to discuss with all of you the questions: what has to be done to develop climate justice around the world, and more concrete, do we have solutions ready that do justice to the structural inequality and unfair distribution of social, economic, and political opportunities between the communities that populate the earth? Is there a danger, as some claim, of falling again into old colonialist structures of paternalism through Europe-American dominance in climate agreements and the declaration of climate strategies? What is the role of global networks, intergovernmental organizations, and the international civil society in this context? How can we empower the most vulnerable, and whose task is this? How can we acknowledge how in our approaches the creation and solution of the problems we are facing as global community are entangled? And relating to these questions, how should we use, for example, empathy? How can we build coalitions to tackle these challenges? And who should we invite to speak with each other who isn't speaking with each other yet? Last but not least, what is the role of culture in all these challenges? And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to our moderator, Andreas Kraemer, who is the founder of the Ecological Institute and director of the Oceano Azul Foundation, and a real expert on environmental policy himself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Odila, for that generous introduction and framing of today's debate. Odila, you already introduced María Fernanda Espinosa a little bit. María, it's a really great pleasure to see you again, and I just regret that it is just a screen. And there is nobody else who I think could speak equally to peace and human rights, international relations, health, environment and climate change, and the question of justice than you, from your experience as a national politician, as embedded in the regional institutions in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as global. And it's really difficult to say what you are. You're a diplomat, politician, academic, but you're also a poet. And as a minister in Ecuador, you've covered foreign affairs, trade and integration, but also cultural and natural heritage, as well as defense. That is a broad range of issues. Few politicians in any country cover that sort of range and have covered it as well as you have done. And in addition, you're also an ambassador and former ambassador and permanent representative. And some say once an ambassador, and always to be addressed as Your Excellency. And at the moment you have so many active roles. There are too many to spell out here, and I won't do that. But with justification, The BBC has listed you as one of the 100 most inspiring and influential women in 2019. The floor is yours, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for this very generous introduction. Thank you, Odila, and thank you to the organizers of today's web talk on climate justice. So allow me to start by saying that I often say that climate change is not the problem, but a symptom of a systemic crisis, of a fractured relationship between the economy, society, nature, and politics. And I think that the question on climate justice we are addressing today is not only a technical matter. It cannot be explained only by the arithmetic of emissions. That is already very unfair, but it is rather a matter of great geopolitical importance. The future of security, of peace, of development depends very much on how we tackle and solve the climate emergency. And there is an initial paradox that I would like to share with you. You know, on one hand, science is so clear. It's telling us that the only way to save not only the planet, but the human species is by cutting in half emissions by 2030 and reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. And we know that more than 70% of the total emissions come from the energy sector. And however, efforts to stabilize our climate should necessarily consider the development needs of the global South, in particular, their need for affordable energy sources that are so essential for production, for transportation, for the fight against poverty. And let's here only remember the first source of injustice. Let's only remember, I was saying that 940 million people, 13% of the world's population, do not have access to electricity. And 3 billion, meaning 40% of the world, do not have access to clean fuel for cooking. So that's where the problem starts, I would say. So, you know, the objectives that we hear time and again, you know, phasing out coal production, stopping new fossil fuel projects, or ending fossil fuel subsidies, although we know are critical for addressing the climate crisis, we also know that they will have profound social, political, and economic impacts in developing countries. Let's just, you know, consider for a minute, if northern industrialized and wealthy countries have you know, great difficulties regarding swift and effective ecological transitions with a lot of resources, with the technology. Let's only imagine how oil-dependent countries in the developing world, such as Angola, Congo, South Sudan, Timor-Leste, my own country, Ecuador, Guyana, will end oil production in a matter of 10 or 20 years when, you know, this income accounts for more than 60, sometimes even 70% of all their fiscal revenues. Even powerful economies pushed for watering down the Glasgow language on coal, as we know, and we will come back to that a little later. So in spite of the good intentions, the pledges, the billions for climate stabilization, a reality check, I think it's urgently needed. The fight against climate change has to consider the development needs of the global South. The UN Convention on Climate abides by this critical principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And let's see, you know, how this principle translates into practice. So the first question is whether the climate crisis requires a coalition of the willing or a concerted universal multilateral agreement. And I am on the side, and of course, having been the president of the UN General Assembly, I can tell you that I strongly believe that the climate emergency is a litmus test for the multilateral system as a whole. I think its very nature of being transboundary, of being global, of affecting every country, regardless of size, of GDP, it absolutely requires a global solution. It requires an international law scaffold, and we do have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It requires established commitments, such as the Paris Agreement. It requires a platform for dialogue, agreement, and negotiation, and this is what the Conference of the Parties are about. And of course, it's not just a black and white scenario. Progress in G7, G20 spaces are critical. The G20 countries are responsible for about 80% of global emissions. So it's important that they step up, that they have a strong commitment. But however, as I mentioned, I strongly believe that a balanced, fair, accountable, and legitimate approach needs to come from the G193 or 197, sorry, as it is the case of the number of parties to the UN Convention on Climate Change. Sometimes people ask why the UN has 193 member states and the convention has 197 parties. And of course, that includes Palestine as an observer country. It includes the Holy See. It includes the European Union, and it includes two countries that are not members of the UN, but they are parties to the convention. So again, here, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in emissions, in finance, in loss and damage is absolutely critical. And here I have to say that governance matters. Monitoring and accountability matter. We need clear targets, verifiable compliance, increased international solidarity for a global ecological transition, a financial package to support the developing countries, at least, the 100 billion every year starting in 2020, as it was agreed by the Paris Agreement and before in Cancun. And perhaps the other key issue is climate finance, has to address equally mitigation efforts and adaptation. We know that adaptation and resilience building is critical for developing countries in the same way that technology transfer and capacity development is also critical. So my fear after watching carefully Andreas, what happened in Glasgow, I was going to say, my fear is a weakening of the trust between high emitters and climate victims and vulnerable countries. So there is a lot of homework to do to strengthen confidence and trust among parties, to strengthen confidence and trust between governments and civil society, of youth organizations. There is a trust building that needs to happen between the scientific community and policy and decision makers. And here, I truly see Europe, Germany, and its new government that it's being put together and announced, I think, as we speak. But, I see Germany playing a key role in trust building among parties and sectors. So I was saying there's a lot of homework to do. Europe, Germany, they have a bridging, a trust building role that is, I think, critically important. We still need to address the existing gaps and to curb climate change. And I'm not going to go into the details, perhaps during the conversation, but in mitigation only, the gap is of approximately 80%. That we are behind to keep, the temperature rise by 1.5 degrees as agreed in the Paris Agreement. So we need to scale up mitigation commitments, refresh the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, which are the national commitments, especially from industrialized countries and high emitters. The shorthand of that is greater ambition is needed. We know that current national pledges are not good enough to keep the 1.5 degree increase. The number two is climate finance, the goal of the Paris Agreement. I just mentioned that 100 billion annually. by 2020. We know that it has not been met. And we already know that the number is far from what is really needed for a low carbon ecological transition in developing countries. So we are speaking trillions, and it's not me saying it, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And of course, when we speak about these gaps are also symptoms of more structural and profound shortages and inequalities. Basically, we're experiencing a policy gap between science, policy, and a governance gap as well. We know what to do. The science is clear. We need to make sure that institutional, legal, regulatory mechanisms are in place so we can overcome the implementation deficit. So we think that, and we know that multilateral responses to stabilize climate have to be multidimensional, connect the agendas of sustainable development, of fighting inequalities, of looking at the connection between climate, conflict risk, and peace. And perhaps I'm sure that we're going to speak about what happened during COP, and people are interested in discussing a little more about that. And I would say you can see the glass half full or half empty. And when you look at the positives, the good news of COP26, I think that what I would highlight is the great public attention, the headlines, the news. For the first time, the headlines, I would say, equaled these from the ones from the COVID. There was a huge social mobilization, civil society in the streets, citizens, young activists, extremely powerful. So climate had world's attention, that's for sure. And that's, I would say, a very positive note. But the downside was that in spite of the code red and the climate emergency, I see that the Glasgow Pact was disappointing for most, including the UN Secretary General, the COP president also, and of course for countries for which 0.1 temperature rise is a death sentence. And this includes small island developing states, low-income countries, etc. And what are the good news? The good news is we finalized the Paris rulebook. This is a COP jargon, but it's important because it's the operational, the roadmap for implementation of the Paris Agreement. There was agreement on the issue of carbon markets, of common timeframes to measure NDCs and the transparency framework. These are technicalities, but they're important for implementation of climate agreements. There was also a global methane pledge by 100 countries to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2020. Between 2020 and 2030, the 140 countries with 20 billion for nature-based solutions and reforestation and ecosystem restoration. I think that was also powerful. 130 trillion pledge from the private sector, an agreement between the two biggest emitters, China and the US. But all the news that I mentioned, the pledge on methane, the 140 countries for ecosystem restoration, the 120 trillion, etc. We have to acknowledge that these are outside of the realm of the actual negotiation within the convention. And the bad news, of course, you know, the weaker language on the original phase out call by 2050, replaced by phase down of unabated coal. It is a huge difference, and perhaps we can discuss later. The other, you know, very sad outcome was the loss and damage financial compensation for the most vulnerable countries, replaced by language like dialogue, assessment, technical cooperation. And this outcome really hurt the vulnerable countries, the small island developing states. And the number three, I would say, I'm sure that we all heard these trillions of pledges, etc. But what I can say is that there is anarchy and lack of clarity in the climate finance package. We don't know exactly what is public, what is private. There is a study from last year from Oxfam that shows that around 80% of the funds already being delivered are in the form of loans that poor countries have to pay back, basically, for climate adaptation and mitigation. So this should not happen. And basically, there is a list of prescriptions of what we need to do, and perhaps we can come back to that. So we don't do only analysis, but perhaps some guidance on what needs to happen. We know basically that to reach climate justice, we have to revert what happened in history. Over the past 25 years, the richest 10% of the global population has been responsible for more than half of all carbon emissions. And the poorest, 50% of our population, were responsible for just 7% of the emissions. So, and if we add that, the historical emissions, plus the COVID-19 crisis scenario, we see that developing countries are really between the wall and a hard place. External debt stocks of developing countries have reached I think it's 10.6 trillion. It's the highest level of indebtedness on record. For that reason, some countries have decided to expand their agricultural and oil frontier, including my own countries, to address the pressing fiscal needs they have, including for education, for health, for food. And the impacts are not only economic, there is a close relationship between also migration and climate change. I would say that the migration crisis connected to the climate emergency should be something that we need to address seriously. The formal numbers say that we have around 23 million climate refugees, and the numbers are expecting to increase exponentially if we do not something about it. So just to close now, I think that we need to close the gaps, the existing gaps on mitigation, on finance. We need to make sure that basically the investment levels and the financial packages for developing countries are in place, that we have our accounts, clarity in our accounts. As I mentioned before, 50% of investment has to go to adaptation and resilience building in the global south, and not only to mitigation. And at the end of the day, this is a matter of lifestyles. We need proper governance, proper legislation, proper policy, etc. But at the end of the day, I truly believe that we need to transform our high carbon lifestyles. I think that carbon pricing, carbon offsetting is highly insufficient. I call this a Band-Aid approach for a systemic crisis, and it doesn't work. A Band-Aid approach is not going to heal the wounds we have inflicted to our planet in a way. And sorry for this poetic metaphor, but that's how basically, I see it. And perhaps we can discuss later, but in what are the structural, the profound causes of the symptom of the climate emergency? And there's several, but perhaps just to mention two very quickly, I see a profound disconnect between the times of nature and the times of politics. And I say this as a politician: long-term and intergenerational equity versus short-termism, meaning new elections, thinking about next elections and not, next generations. The other major issue is this disconnect between science, policy, and practice, and the cycles and times to implement. And perhaps lastly, I think that we cannot address highly complex issue with a linear and simplistic mindset. And I see that Odila was very, her statement about new epistemologies, new ways of thinking, bringing in traditional knowledge, the voice and agency of indigenous peoples is so critical at this time. This is critical if we are thinking about this new social contract that now has become a mantra, a new Green Deal to reconcile politics, economy, and the earth system in a way, which is the scaffold of our well-being. And here again, I would say that in looking at the European Green Deal, the role of the EU, of Germany, is critical. Greater solidarity, more co-responsibility towards the global south. And we see, I think it's 1.8 trillion euros for the European Green Deal, which includes leaving no person or place behind. This should, of course, include the global south. So just to conclude, I think that we are in a point of inflection in world history. I don't want to use grandiose words, but it's true. I truly hope that the post-COP26 recovery process would lead us to more ambitious results next year, COP27 in Egypt. I think that I'm a stubborn optimist, as late Kofi Annan used to say. The climate crisis is human-made, so we have the knowledge, the technology, the resources to win this battle for climate justice. And for that, we need the right institutional infrastructure in place, of course, but above all, we need the will, the political will. And I hope that, and I expect that we will be able to really curb climate change once and for all with justice and inclusiveness. Thank you, Andreas, and all of you for your patience, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this tour de force and explaining not only why, in your mind, the multilateral system involving 197 countries is the right way to go, but also for your analysis of what happened in Glasgow and the underlying forces or factors that explain why, in your view, it is so difficult. So please keep thinking about it as we move on in the program, because the next one is a very unusual new perspective. It comes from Barbara Marcel, who is an artist and filmmaker from Brazil. Her current work is in the exhibition Umbrales at the IFA Gallery in Stuttgart, and it focuses on questions of ecological awareness, diversity, and gender equality in Chile in the global context. And you're joining us from Chile today, Barbara, I understand. Please open your microphone, and Maria, you close yours, please. Barbara studied at the Bauhaus University in Weimar in Germany, the Institute for Art in Context at the University of the Arts in Berlin, and the Universidade Estácio de Sá in Rio de Janeiro. Barbara, the floor is yours for your statement. I look forward to it.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Daniela, for the invitation. I hope you hear me well. Thank you, Andreas, for the warming presentation as well for my CV. So yes, I'm speaking from Santiago de Chile today, and I'm here because of the exhibition that you mentioned that is now at IFA Gallery in Stuttgart. So the Umbrales exhibition is a collective exhibition curated by Bettina Korintenberg, and it is an outcome that relates to a biennial of art and media in Santiago de Chile. I'm participating with a video installation that it's showing how it was my participation here in 2019 for a residency or artistic residency proposed by the Goethe Institute at the time. An invitation for an artivism to engage with the social environmental conflicts in the region of Biobío in Chile. I'm originally actually coming from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro, where I studied cinema, but I'm based in Berlin since 12 years. So I'm in my artistic practice, I deal a lot with this long-term research and connections between global South and global North, more specifically Latin America and Germany relations, since from historical relations regarding the history of science, but also current social environmental conflicts and inequalities that can be observed in this world system, very unequal world system we inhabited, as Maria Fernanda was telling us. And so I'm here today as an artist. I'm not sure if I can give you so much inputs regarding the specific. I'm not a specialist in climate change, but two of my last projects deals with the climate change. So the first one, it's part of another exhibition at the ZKM, Centre für Kunst und Media in Karlsruhe. It's an exhibition curated by Bruno Latour and among other curators, and it's still available to be visited in case any of you want to see. I will leave here in the website also the link for the online exhibition. This work that I did for the critical zones, the proposal was to visit this tall tower in the middle of the Amazon. That is a project built by the Max Planck Institute and together with the INPA, the Institute for Amazonian Research, in the middle of the forest in the state of Amazon in Brazil. And so I went there to actually start to document how scientists are proving or collecting data from the atmosphere to deal with the whole climate crisis and to produce data, and knowledge regarding the climate, the carbon emissions and other. But in the end, with the project, it felt like it was not enough to only document how scientists are developing these knowledges. So I proposed to build actually a kind of an alliance between the scientists, or an encounter between the scientists and a few local activists, especially women activists that are very leading the movements in the territory of the Amazon. So I have one indigenous activist from the Tapajós and the other one a radio communicator, not identifying herself as indigenous, but Riverside, born in the Amazon. And we go with them together and we enter this Babel Tower of the Ato Tower in the middle of the Amazon to understand how the scientists are a kind of an activist as well, a kind of activist to produce this knowledge. Of course, this encounter produced a lot of, let's say, it makes visible the whole inequalities in the process of what we acknowledge as knowledge, and what and all these inequalities also in the production of knowledge in relation from global South and North. So it is a very complex project, but I'm sure, you can also engage with it somehow. And the proposal is actually to open up a space for this, for discussing and to observe how this life of people in the territories can be somehow connected to this production of knowledge coming from outside. And how to produce a certain alliance between people who investigate the forest and people who actually live from the forest in a community, in a very sustainable relation to their ecosystems. In the project that I present at IFA Gallery, I shot it, as I said, in 2019 in Chile. And it was supposed to be a project that culminates with the COP25 that was actually previously planned to be holding place in Brazil, but of course with the negationist government of Bolsonaro, he refused the COP25 to happen in Brazil, and then it went to Piñera, so it was supposed to happen in Chile, and because of the uprisings, in the end, as we all know, it went to Madrid. Still, I was here and I could see that also a big part and a very impressive part of the COPs around the world are the parallel events of the civil society meetings. And I found, I discovered for the first time the existence, for instance, of Carpa de las Mujeres, a feminist meeting of all Latin American grassroots movements. And it was an extremely beautiful and powerful encounter of 3 days in the University of Chile. And many of the activists invited to go to the COP25 in Madrid, actually they did a statement and came to Chile, even though there was a moment of very political turbulence with the uprisings here. So I think with my work and the role of art, that was one of the questions raised here in the beginning. I try to not only to document, I believe that the videos that I produce, they also can, beyond document this voices and gatherings, like collective production of knowledge and activism, they also affect people. Right? So I believe that moving images and producing sound and following certain people and to see how they act in their territories in defense of those territories, it's very inspiring, and this can affect other people and can therefore engage other people to act together, to think locally and globally. So I come from a generation in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro. I remember the Eco 92, the first preceding COPs in Rio. And so I come from the generation that since 7 years old, we are supposed to start thinking ecologically. And I remember that one of the outputs of the Eco 22 in Rio was already this, the thought of we not only can think locally and act globally, we have to both think locally and globally and act globally and locally. So that's what I would say for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, for that, making that connection and inviting us to think about the role of art in translating between the language of science and the language of the people, and to interpret things and to see things not just with the mind, but also with the heart. And we move on to another fascinating person for another statement. And I hope you're there, Sushmina Baidya. Yes, you are. There you are. She is the co-founder of YOUTHive in Nepal, a network of young people promoting youth leadership through mentoring and peer-to-peer learning. So it speaks to some of the capacity building questions that came up in the chats already. She's also the former regional manager and fellow in residence for Asia Oceania at Peace First, which is a global nonprofit organization dedicated to work with young people between 13 and 25. They catch them whilst they're young and impressionable and make an investment at that stage. But Sushmina started engaging as a youth activist at the age of 15 in Nepal and committed to work on youth leadership and community development. So I do not regard naturally every young person as vulnerable, but amongst the vulnerable are very many young people. So who would be better to speak how to empower the vulnerable amongst the young people than you, Sushmina? The floor is yours.
Thank you. This was quite an introduction. But yeah, namaste to everyone. I'm Sushmina from Nepal. Currently, I'm here in the UK to study MSc Children, Youth and International Development. Quite obvious. And besides my studies, as Andreas said, I also run an organization, YOUTHive Nepal, that works to empower young people, specifically to promote socioeconomic opportunities through leadership and mentoring. And today I'm here to talk about my perspective on climate justice through the work that I have been doing so far. But usually when I start this introduction with what I do, my engagement as a youth activist, and then moving on to talking about climate justice, like there's a tendency that people keep, like most of them I face, that they ask me if I changed my career trajectory to being a climate activist than a youth activist. And this is something quite natural that I have been facing a lot. And that just makes me think about the whole concept of how we think climate justice, which we kind of pursue it as only the space for those who are working actively in this area, or those who are actually really passionate about environment. And then when I was working at a youth-led organization in 2013, most of our work, we were inclined, our work in general was focused on youth leadership, but one of our thematic area was also on youth advocacy for climate justice. Young people at our organization were conducting discussion forums, drafting charts on ecological rights, rallies, street actions, everything that demanded for a healthy environment. Similarly, like in 2019 as well, we organized March Trek to one of the Himalayas in Nepal to set up this cleaning trek campaign. We had with 32 young people from Nepal to trek along the trails of this Himal while we had this series of cleaning campaigns for a week. But while we did all of these climate action-based programs and projects, I also do feel like civil societies have lack resource on fully engaging young people, in the sense that all of these actions, however meaningful it was, but it still raised a lot of questions of actually who is responsible to fully equip young people with resources to advocate towards climate justice. And also another questions of whether advocacy is really enough. Is advocacy by young people enough to demand for climate justice? And one of the main question is, and this also relates quite well with what María shared in the beginning about trust building, is how can we make sure that social actors within our ecosystem interact within themselves and outside as well, so that everybody shares that vision of climate justice. And this brings me to another point, which I often think about when it comes to climate action, climate justice, is when we curate ideas, how often do we think about inclusivity, like things like inclusivity or ideas that integrates our values as human beings. We do that a lot because this is not something that we have to do, but because this is ethical and this is the most basic thing that is expected. My point here is that what I feel is that we need to start thinking about climate justice as a value to integrate in anything that we do, not just as another discipline or not just as another field, but we should rather, it's time to change the narrative of thinking beyond climate justice as just another discipline, but as a core value. Only then we'll be able to empower young people with, or we will be able to find concrete solutions as to how we could address these issues that we have. Like for me, climate justice, when I think about it as rethinking about our existing structures, where we like reframing our knowledge to relearn the efficient mechanism that is centric towards sustainability. Like for instance, like our current policies that needs to dismantle the existing structure of being heavily focused on industrialized centric development, and rather just focusing more on how we can bring communities together, one that apprehends to capture the authenticity of a community without solely being driven into the need of developmental growth, the other term that I feel is extremely talked about. So yeah, I'm not really sure how much of these words and the experiences that I've shared is relatable, but I'm going to leave with a final thought, And my final thought is, like, while we talk about solutions and changes to equip civil societies, to empower like the vulnerable ones, we also have to make sure to move away from the assumptions that whatever is being implemented on the grounds is actually working. Sometimes whatever the good things that are happening, even if it's working, we still have to question it and shake things up. And we really, really need to step away from standardizing developmental practices and give space for community actors to interact with them themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. You see the applause from Maria Fernanda. Thank you very much for those encouraging words. And yes, showing how networking, how encouragement, but also the capacity building that goes with it, that is necessary, in combination with the necessary critical thinking that allows us not to fall into the traps of the dominant narratives of the received wisdom. So those were very encouraging words within a perfect 5 minutes. Thank you for that. Maria Fernanda, I think you listened to those two ladies presenting their ideas and their approach to these things. Do you have a first reaction?
Well, I'm really touched because on one hand, we see the power of art and the power of beauty in really not only advocating for something, but really having the power to transform the way people relate to nature. We need art. We need new and invigorated narratives. We need young people to wake us up.
That is part of an answer. So I deduce that the young people have not yet put enough pressure on government representatives in the negotiations, because otherwise the level of urgency would have been higher already. What is holding young people back, Sushmina?
I would have to say again, like, also building up on what Maria talked about, trust building. I think this is something that I feel is when it comes to working with the government or building pressure towards the government, the trust is what I feel is missing in between those two actors. One instance that I can show you, which is not related to climate justice, but when YOUTHive was researching about active citizenship among young people, one of the things that came across those discussions were how young people, we did these discussions with young people from India and from Bangladesh and Nepal. And the questions that we asked was that, how well do you think that your voice gets represented in the government level, in policy level, in local level? They said the majority of them responded that in the local level, it's easier to get connected with the leaders there to talk about it. But as you go ahead, the bureaucracy, it gets your words, your voice, it gets suppressed by the heavily complicated bureaucracy in the way that they feel underrepresented. So I feel like the notion of this top-down approach is what needs to be dismantled, number one, where the way that the voices of these young people, the way that they are representing their voices or pressurizing the government needs to be stronger from the local level itself, so that slowly it can reach to the higher governmental level is what I feel needs to be done in order to give that more push towards the government.
Thank you, Sushmina. I can relate to this challenge of climbing up the hierarchy, and the further up you go, the more difficult it is. And I can tell you, I am now 63 years old and it's still with me. It's more challenging to get access at the top. That is a fact of life. Barbara, there is a question directed at you. Where do you see the interlinkage between social and ecological crisis in Brazil, and what might be the role of art in this context?
Thank you, Daniela. Yeah, for me, it was always very clear, the interconnection, the discourse in Brazil. I mean, Brazil is the 7th biggest emitter of carbon in the planet. So it's also a huge country with we all know, like very unequal, as Maria Fernanda was saying. The whole Latin America history is a history of violence, colonialism, and that it still marks this relations and slavery. So we have a very a scenario that is it's actually very hard to not connect the social and environmental issues. And when we think about, like, yeah, as we were saying before, the climate change is human produced, and the whole Anthropocene discourse is always pointing that out, that humans are as if we were like naturally mean or naturally like destructive. And this was our you know, like way of dealing with nature, to master nature and so on. I have another experience by engaging with communities in Brazil, especially the very local and grassroots communities. They are all living in a very sustainable way with their environments, because they perceive directly how these environments are being destroyed, and they depend on it. So of course, I come from a very big city. We have the biggest forest like within the city. So it's a city that is also, this relation between nature and culture is almost, you cannot put it in a very oppositional way. Of course, we as city dwellers, we have a little bit more alienated relations to the natural, let's say, but still it's, I think the discourses on the social environmental justice in Latin America in general are way more undiscussable, because that's very, it's the very people who are suffering directly from most of the climate crisis. And how art can help on that, I think that's what I was trying to say before. It's like to not only raise an awareness on how we are connected, and our body is also a kind of a territory that is connected to the whole environment globally. I think art can help to bring this discourse into discussions in a sensible way, in a as Maria Fernanda was saying, also like in a aesthetical sensibility, bringing this sensibility in other senses, not only like in discourse. Yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. I will share a little anecdote. We at Ecologic Institute, we've also tried to link environmental policy and environmental sciences with art in two different ways. I myself, co-started, helped in starting something that looked at artistic expression of the changes that global overheating brings to the Arctic. Which is a place that few people can see with their own eyes. And we don't want everybody to see it with their own eyes, because that would damage the place as well as the planet. So it is vitally important that people report about the Arctic with visual means, photography and other things. So that was very successful, and it allowed us to bring into the room to talk about Arctic policy and Arctic governance. These are things that very few people care about. But as soon as there was a picture exhibition of somebody who painted something, people came, and because they were interested in the visuals, they were attracted by the painter's language, by the colors, by the atmosphere of vernissage of an exhibition. They just came there, and they were prepared to listen to the scientists and the policymakers and the people talking about dry governance stuff as well. And they actually found it stimulating to think about those aspects as well. And at the same time, those dry nerds that care about governance processes in the Arctic, they found it really amazing to talk to people in everyday language, like they would in their family, about their experience, and were really pleased that there was an engagement of that nature. So it worked really well. So I can only encourage everybody to think about how to use the emotion and the visual and the music and the poetry, those emotional languages in order to provide a bridge between the dry scientists with their numbers, with their methods, and their dry stuff talking about rules and procedures, to bring life to their debate and help them build the bridges to policymakers and society as a whole. So thank you very much for that example, and there you go. And then there are two entries from Boko Ike Schneider, and I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but if any of you want to take it on and speak about the role of Europe and the perception of Europe, and how it sees vulnerable people in other parts of the world, and how it is perceived to be seen vulnerable people in the other part of the world, please do so. Maria, would you like to give it a start?
Well, yes, on the issue of capacity building, for young people, etc. I think the discussion is bigger than that, because when we speak about the 100 billion per year, when we speak about clarity and transparency and accountability on climate finance, there are two other preconditions called the means of implementation. How is that we are going to be serious about a proper ecological transition, new energy matrices? It has to do with technology transfer, low carbon technologies being reachable and for developing countries, and also capacity building in terms of institutional responses, in terms of legal frameworks, in terms of accountability mechanisms. So this is the big picture. But to be very honest with you, yes, we need more climate literacy worldwide. But believe me, in my experience, I lived and worked with indigenous peoples in the Ecuadorian Amazon for 5 years, and they are the ones who know their stuff. Young leaders from indigenous communities in the Amazon, believe me, they really know what it's like, and the impacts of deforestation, the impacts of climate change. Young activists from small island developing states, I know hundreds of them. The Sushminas of the world, they are so much on top that I think that it's not on that front. On the contrary, I think that decision makers, policy makers need to learn from them, need to listen. And in politics, one of the shortages is that we are so used, and I'm including myself on that list. I'm not active in politics anymore, but basically we are so used to speaking and so not used to listening. So when Sushmina was saying the trust building is so critical, the trust building is done when you are prepared to listen. And I think that decision makers, our leaders, should be prepared to listen. And that's a critical part of confidence and trust building among parties, between the wealthy industrialized countries and the poor countries, the most vulnerable. It's critical when decision makers listen to civil society. And when we speak about multilateral approaches, I'm a multilateralist myself, but one of the critical issues is how you bring in the voice of society as a whole to inform decision-making. Sushmina was speaking about this bottom-up approach in decision-making. We really seriously need to put a human face, to the impacts of climate change. And I'm also speaking as a person who had, I sat in Paris for 3 weeks without sleep, so we could have, the Paris Agreement. I sat in Cancun and Copenhagen. I have sat as a climate negotiators for a decade. And sometimes you are in the word by word, line by line, and sometimes you forget the people you're working for, the people you're representing. And this is an exercise that seems, very matter of fact, but it doesn't happen. I'm speaking firsthand experience. When I was exhausted in Cancun or Paris or Copenhagen without sleep, I mean, that's why the voices of indigenous women of the Amazon, of islanders, of people that have to move, these 23 million climate refugees, they need to have a voice. They need to be heard. They need to be part of the decision-making equation.
Thank you very much. And Barbara and Sushmina have been listening and nodding heavily. Barbara, 2 minutes for a closing statement, perhaps 90 seconds.
Okay, yes, no, I mean, I think Maria Fernanda already said what I was thinking here. Like, I do think we need more support on this people and scholarships for them to act globally and to be more in the center where decisions are made. So for me to live in Europe has been also a challenge in these terms, like to think on my privilege and how to act in a way, not only representing, but connecting, creating those bridges and bringing this awareness also in Berlin. I think, yeah, we have this very bad Fehlerdenken, like sometimes that people in the most vulnerable or developing countries are yeah, just polluting and just you know, destroying nature. We have to think that many like millions of people defending the environment, and therefore that's why we still have forests like the Amazon. It is a cultivated garden by indigenous people in Brazil, and it must be acknowledged as a property of those peoples. So I sum up as Maria Fernanda, and thank you, Sushmina, as well. Very inspiring words. I'm happy to be here, and I hope we can meet again personally or e-meet. It was a great pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara. And you pointed to something that we had at the last web talk, where we ended with the idea that we need to rethink property rights and how they're defined and how they're being used and how they're being abused in today's culture. Your closing statement, Sushmina?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Maria and Barbara, both of them. My closing statement would be to stick on my last statement that I shared when during my time, is to we have this tendency of kind of, which is also quite similar to what Maria and Barbara just shared. We have this tendency to kind of think that, like, for when we think about working with young people or empowering young people, we kind of think that it's because we have already experienced being a young person ourselves, we kind of know what they're going through. But that's not true. We have already gone past that situation where young people now might have been facing different context altogether. So we really need to keep thinking about, or keep like dismantling our structures, finding ways to kind of questioning our existence, questioning the current policies that we have, and just not presenting a recipe, you know, like, this is the rule book, here you go, this is how you're supposed to do it. So I guess I feel like this standardizing of our practices is what I feel like we really need to move away from, and give our community actors an opportunity to interact in the ecosystem with the policymakers, with government, and that's only when we can actually think about going in a more holistic kind of approach. And yeah, overall, thank you so much. This is an amazing discussion. I really, really enjoyed it, listening to every one of you. And thank you so much for making me a part of this.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your closing statements. It was fun. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much also from my side. It was a real pleasure to host you and to listen to the discussion. Thank you for all the contributions. Thank you again for our cooperation partners and to make this possible. And also thank you to Christina and Daniela from IFA to make this possible. Yeah, I take very much away a confirmation that we all should seek for a more integrated approach. And this means also in politics, more a cross-sectorial approach. And I also, my takeaway is an affirmation of, I read some Bruno Latour too, and the idea of a territory, and to look actually on to very, very crucially on how an actual individual is acting in its environment. And this also means to be more honest about the materiality of the ecosystem and how it's dealt with in our everyday life. And this also leads to the idea to listen to the individuals and to demand from individuals in some positions to listen and acknowledge every individual. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Odila, and thank you to all the participants for your interest and your participation here. Thank you very much for your participation, and here we sign off with our thank you slide and a little bit of music from Nick Evans, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the 1st of December. Bye.